Welcome back, everyone. Welcome back. Welcome back. Hope you enjoyed the breakout session. Our closing plenary speaker is Kavin Senapathy. Kavin is a writer and journalist who covers science, health, medicine, food, and parenting for outlets like Self, Slate, The Daily Beast, Forbes, Sci Moms, Sci Show, Undark, Skeptical Inquirer, and more. Her chapter in the recent MIT Press book, Pseudoscience, is titled Swaying Pseudoscience, The Inoculation Effect. When she isn't writing, tweeting, or working, Kavin is busy being a science mom to her 2 children. Please welcome Kavin Senapathy.
Hi, everyone. Can you see my slides? Okay, I see a thumbs up in the audience. This works. Okay, so I'm really disappointed to not be with everyone in the Chicago, especially the Divas Ball. I was looking forward to that a lot. But I'm glad to be there in spirit, and I hope to be there, or I definitely plan to be there next year. But, you know, speaking of spirits, Candace had talked about making a sort of altar or shrine to your deceased loved ones. And I love that idea. So I think I'm going to do it. But meanwhile, a little show and tell before I jump in. What I do already have in my home is a shrine to humans that I worship. So Exhibit A, I'm not sure if you can see, this is my Beyonce prayer candle. And I will only keep Jay-Z as long as she'll have him, but he's there for now. And I have hopes that he will be there for a long time. But about me briefly, trying to advance the screen, there we go. You heard a little about it in the intro, but I'm a writer and journalist covering food, health, and science. And so for today, I considered a few ideas relevant to some of what I cover. And I asked Mandisa if she had something in mind, and she said that she was thinking I could talk about racism in the skeptic community, which I covered last year. And I didn't want to do the same talk that I've done for other skeptical organizations. I wanted to do one especially for us. So if you're on Twitter and you like to live tweet, feel free to use the Skeptics So White hashtag. Twitter is my preferred social media to doom scroll, so I hang out there. So feel free to get a hold of me on Twitter too. So, so today, enjoy this stock photo of a whiny white boy. My husband said I should have used a picture of him, but I used a stock photo. But so today I want to show that not only are many US skeptical groups dominated by white people, and not only have they participated in marginalizing people, including women, BIPOC, and LGBTQ folks, they're also infused with a sort of white mediocrity that practically all US institutions and systems have historically upheld. So in the US, I think it's time to call white skeptics to task when they say they care about women of color and about empiricism, science, and the truth. And I'll also share how we as women of color can exercise skepticism in our lives and in our families and our work. So Sikivu Hutchinson has written multiple times about secular and skeptical organizations, lily white boards of directors and conference speaker lineups. And it's really such a fitting way to put it. In a nutshell, the lily white movement was a faction of the Republican Party in the South following the Civil War. And it embraced Jim Crow and sought to push Black leaders out of the party. And this was an explicit movement with explicit intention. But as we know, racism has evolved to be more subtle, often without any ill intent whatsoever. And that doesn't mean it's benign or excusable. So about the skeptic movement, briefly, where there's pseudoscience, there are intrepid skeptics fighting against the harm that it perpetuates. Or that's what the skeptical movement would like to think. As Carl Sagan famously put it, skepticism applies science not only as a method, but as a way of thinking. Now, I'll note that skepticism intersects with secularism, of course, because of empiricism. There is no evidence for gods. The skeptical movement has been around in various forms for a long time, but it began in its contemporary form in Europe around the mid-20th century. And today there are skeptical groups sprinkled around the world. Now, the Committee for Skeptical Inquiry, which has published Skeptical Inquirer since 1976, is widely credited with raising the movement's profile. Note also that CSI became a program of the Center for Inquiry in 2015. So I took these photos of Skeptical Inquirer magazine while I was in Belgium in 2018 for the European Congress of Skeptical Organizations. So shout out to them. When a board member of the Belgian Skep organization hosted me at their home and showed me their skeptical collection. So that was a sort of fun time capsule. So now I'll share my experience with the Committee for Skeptical Inquiry and CFI, which sheds light, I think, on what I think is really going on with the elephant in the skeptics' room, namely that they think that women of color and non-binary people of color and people of color in general don't belong. And whether that belief is conscious or unconscious is besides the point. So this slide has a couple of visuals of them tokenizing me. For 3 SciCons, I was the only non-white speaker in the lineup. And throughout the time that I wrote a column for Skeptical Inquirer, hosted their flagship podcast, and spoke at their events, I was CFI's one and only public-facing non-white associate. So although I was wary when they increasingly brought me into their fold, I thought, perhaps naively, that I could help bring about change. But even though CFI valued my face enough to put it at the top of their marketing materials time and again, they repeatedly minimized my concerns. And once I started speaking up behind the scenes, things got rocky. And once I started speaking out publicly, their leadership did their most to try to demean and erase me, just like so many white organizations have fumbled similar situations with increasing frequency in the last couple of years, or at least with increasing visibility in the last couple of years. But the point is, it would eventually become clear that I had allowed CFI to use me to create this image of diversity with an expectation that that I would toe the line. So over time, a few things about CFI got to me, and over time I had internal conversations with their higher ups about some of their outright bigotry. So one incident in 2018 was typical, and it involved their sort of mascot, Richard Dawkins. And I had intentionally avoided most of Dawkins' on-stage appearances at the Vegas conferences I attended in 2016 and 2017, but I decided to sit in the audience in 2018. And he was presenting the Richard Dawkins Award, which goes to outstanding individuals who have significantly furthered the cause of reason and science, to recipient British actor Stephen Fry. So I was sitting toward the back of this ballroom at the Las Vegas Westgate Resort and Casino, and the award presentation had just wrapped up, and the audience was ready for this live conversation between the British celebs. And so I thought to myself, okay, yes, three British guys assuming the role of rational men. Dear mortal baby Jesus, help us. But 40 minutes into the onstage conversation, my ears sort of perked up when I heard Dawkins say to Stephen Fry, and I'm quoting, "You've said, Stephen, that the catastrophe of Trump and Brexit is less a triumph of the right as a failure of the left." And so I think we all know about the false equivalency between the right and the left, along the lines of the very fine people on both sides sort of comments. And Dawkins continued, "Do you recognize the phrase regressive left? Do you have a view on it?" The question took as its flawed, entirely unskeptical and unhumanist premise that people spreading racist hate exist on the same moral plane as those who oppose it. So then Fry goes, he's answering the question, "This Grand Canyon has opened up in America and really across the world, and it's getting wider every day. Therefore, people on each side of the divide, they have to shout louder and gesticulate more horribly to be heard by the other side. And they're just making noises and screaming." And so I'm kind of thinking, oh boy, what's he gonna say? And he says, and I'm quoting, "I like to think of myself and right-thinking people as cowering in the ravine at the bottom, unsure what to do. On the one hand, you have an alt-right bringing up all kinds of nasty racist thoughts and divisions, but you also have a preposterous illiberal liberal left shouting out this jargonistic nonsense." And so I'm thinking to myself, like, make it make sense. And so what Fry said next kind of was it. So he says, kind of in this very fed up, almost joking manner, he says, "If I have to hear about the patriarchy and cisgender white privilege, blah, blah, blah again," and he sort of guffaws, waving his hands about and feigned in disgust. And I mean, you're free to watch this this video. It's available online, but I'm like, okay, cool. Just make light of some pretty serious stuff that affects people's lives every day. And so we can all agree that the patriarchy and white privilege and cis privilege are very real phenomena with mountains of empirical evidence as backup, even as annoying as some leftist folks can be. So if the language around these facts seems like a joke or jargonistic to a winner of an award for reason and science, and if social justice is regressive to the giver of this award, then in my evidence-based opinion, that award is it's a farce. The emperor has no clothes. But anyway, at the time of the Stephen Fry debacle, I was one of a string of intrepid people who had pointed out CFI's issues over the years, including people in Chicago today at the conference. So things still hadn't changed. And now, after being courted by CFI and settling into my role as its only public-facing Brown associate at the time, I finally called them out publicly on Twitter and Facebook. Another pivotal incident was about a year later when they added yet another older white board member. So Sekivu called out CFI for its lily white board in 2016. And at that point, it had a total of 8 white board members. And later that year, they appointed one non-white board member who was born in China. And then some years went by without any major change when in September of 2019, they made an interesting choice for their 10th board member, another older white person. And as lovely as I'm sure this individual is, I was baffled. So I messaged a couple of their board members and I asked, "You elected another white person to the board? Really?" And one of them replied, and again, I quote, yep, finding people that want to serve on the board and have the appropriate qualifications isn't easy. In response to another similar question about how they're so white, one of their board members replied with a question. And again, I quote, the question was, "Are Asians white?" As if to point out that their board member born in China rendered my question moot. Again, he asked, "Are Asians white?" And I wish this wasn't true. But if that isn't tokenizing, I don't know what is. So enjoy these images of two of my favorite celebs, Amber Ruffin and Tom Hanks, channeling my reaction to those statements. I was first drawn to the skeptics movement by what seemed to be its pursuit of the bald-faced truth. But after those experiences, and after realizing that they were still earnestly entertaining the idea that their leadership's overwhelming whiteness was about qualifications, I let go of illusions that CFI was interested in pursuing the truth. So after CFI and I parted ways in late 2019, they did appoint 2 more non-white board members, which I believe was a reaction to the criticism. But knowing what I know about the facts of how those decisions went down, they intentionally chose not to go with folks for their board who would disrupt their status quo, especially their ideological status quo, I think. But moreover, I know for a fact that CFI actively chose not to adopt and implement a diversity, equity, and inclusion policy. Some dedicated folks put some labor into pushing CFI to take this first step, and it was shot down. So these organizations' content in their blogs and magazines often betrays what they are really about. Take, for instance, the 2018 special issue of Skeptical Inquirer called A Skeptic's Guide to Racism. I don't have time to go into a critique of the content of that issue, but I will say that I have painstakingly confirmed that each and every author in that issue was a white man. So I'll repeat that the image that many skeptics hold of the movement is that where there is pseudoscience, there are skeptics fighting against the injustices and harm that it perpetuates. And that's what the skeptical movement wants to think. Now, this isn't to say that some skeptical groups haven't done worthwhile work exposing pseudoscience and fighting against the harm that it's caused. They certainly have. I'm just checking my chat. Okay, making sure that everything's okay. All right. So yeah, it's not to say that skeptical groups haven't done worthwhile work, because they have, but it just hasn't grown past what it was, at least over a decade ago, or even decades, I would say. So pseudoscience is basically belief practices and methodologies mistakenly regarded as being based on the scientific method. And some of what skeptical groups and magazines and blogs have traditionally covered includes alternative medicine, flat earth, and of course there are many more that I'm not gonna be able to fit in a slide. Now, I agree that these forms of pseudoscience are harmful and they do need opposing, but the skeptical treatment of these tend to lack context. So how does alternative medicine and the distrust that makes pseudoscientific practices appealing, how does that impact women and non-binary people and BIPOC and disabled folks and other groups of people? I'm not seeing nearly enough of that. So a lot of the problem comes down to this. What US-based skeptics groups haven't done in a concerted way is address what I call dehumanizing pseudoscience. What I mean by that is any pseudoscientific investigations that assume that certain groups of people are inherently and fundamentally inferior or different from the default, which is a white default, which was arbitrarily set. So this includes, but isn't limited to, science about people with uteri and breasts who were assigned female at birth, neurodivergent folks, disabled folks, LGBTQ folks, and people of color. And these are just a few examples here of studies and ideologies that, that kind of fit this dehumanizing pseudoscience category. And they appear to this day in highly respected journals. So one about evidence for bisexual orientation among men, and a lot of people, scientists included, took issue with the premise of that study. And then another one in the Journal of Internal Medicine, and I'm actually writing about this for a project coming up, but about the role of physiology in obesity in African Americans, as if African Americans have some innate reason for obesity, and the whole that could be the subject of many talks. So there's plenty of fodder and people who can speak to this for us in our community. But it's often subtle, and again, the intent can be completely benign. Nevertheless, this dehumanizing pseudoscience is among the most harmful of pseudoscience. Now, this slide includes selected examples of a very commonly held idea among people who care about science and who believe that their thinking is scientific. And that's this idea that science is colorblind. So you see these examples of many examples. Dawkins, for instance, in the Ancestor's Tale, he says there's no reason to suppose that race tells you anything about how well qualified someone is for a job. Choose on the basis of ability, and if having done so, you end up with an all-Black sprinting team, so be it. You have not practiced racial discrimination. And Lawrence Krauss, who is actually, there are plenty of scientists with these views. Lawrence Krauss, of course, is an egregious example. But he writes about science that if the system is functioning properly, the people who develop these ideas rise in prominence. The nature of the scientific process requires it to be colorblind. And about the Shut Down STEM campaign that sought to literally shut down STEM for a day so that racism could be addressed, he wrote, "Mantras about systemic racism are hard to square with the principles and necessary protocols of academic science. Scientific organizations have adopted dramatic anti-racist posturing in sudden response to George Floyd's homicide." In the February 2021 issue of Cell, a group of 16 women biomedical researchers argued that racial disparities in NIH funding remains the most insidious barrier to success of Black faculty in our profession. And that doesn't only impact the makeup of the community of scientists, it also destroys innovation and produces biased science, they explained. So the data show that in recent years, research with white researchers was about, principal investigators, was about twice as likely to be funded. And Black researchers have to spend twice the amount of time writing grants to achieve the same funding level. Due to excess stress, Black researchers are more likely to burn out before reaching tenure. The authors complained that many editorials have been written about this fact without effective actions. And analyses of grant proposals revealed that Black researchers are more likely to ask the research questions that will change the status quo. So these are population level studies that can inform interventions to close racial disparities. And by contrast, white researchers are more likely to look at genetic factors within the body. And these studies are more or less important depending on which expert you ask, but it won't fix racial health disparities because race is a social construct. So not everyone will be on an even playing field as these genomic advances make it into clinical practice, unless the impact of racism is rooted out of everything. Yet, Black researchers regularly report being told that health disparities research is not real science. This is an example of how white mediocrity is maintained. It's easier to believe the gaps in achievement between non-white people and white people and in all aspects of life is about qualifications or innate characteristics. So take that statement from the earlier slide, that myth that science is equitable and colorblind, and apply it to the makeup of a board of directors, or even to the makeup of researchers with the most grant funding. And it would go something like, there's no reason to suppose that race tells you anything about how qualified someone is for a research grant. Choose on the basis of ability, and if having done so, you end up with a predominantly white group of scientists, you have not practiced racial discrimination. See what I'm saying? Like, of course, this stuff isn't easy, Mr. Rational Science Brain. Real skepticism is hard work, and the fact that these skeptical groups are making the easy and incorrect conclusions is obvious. So why aren't organizations that claim to oppose harmful pseudoscience looking into all of the dehumanizing pseudoscience that has a stronghold in the scientific community, in the body of science, and in all of our institutions? This is how white mediocrity plays out, in the notion that what they deem is important and unimportant, or scientific or unscientific, reflects what actually is important or scientific. It plays out in the notion that the overwhelming whiteness of intellectual spaces is about qualifications. So there is some progress in some of these groups. Take, for instance, the group of organization that puts on Nexus, the Northeast Conference on Science and Skepticism. These groups include the Skeptics Guide to the Universe podcast and Science-Based Medicine. So the Nexus conference speaker lineups are more diverse in the last couple of years. And I've noticed that they've received a lot of praise for this, and certainly that's a good thing. But if you look at their leadership, the leadership of this group of organizations that puts on this conference, that's receiving praise for its diversity, the leadership and director level people, the roster of science-based medicine writers and the content of their coverage lag behind. So the bottom line is that diversity isn't complete without real radical inclusion. So are there people of color and women of color sitting at the table and taking part in decisions? So how do women of color choose to exercise the tenets of skepticism in our own lives, our communities, and our activism? So when I ask that question, I clearly see that so many women of color are already doing it. And it's really a joy to see. We're not waiting around for these people. While they over-intellectualize, so many of us are out there outsmarting and making change. I can think of so many people in that room today. So to level up going forward as women of color, we have to break through the white mediocrity with our greatness. So to that end, I've come up with an abridged list that is summarized here, and I'll go through them quickly because I think I'm running low on time. I wish I had more, but so we can level up from false dichotomies to nuance. Polarization is often counterproductive, but I see it so much in the skeptics movement. So these ideas of pro-science versus anti-science, pro-GMO versus anti, pro-nuclear energy versus anti. There's just so much more to those conversations, and it doesn't come down most of the time to pro and anti. And also that dichotomy between anecdotes and data. You'll often hear people say, anecdotes aren't data. However, we have to remember that data comes from questions that are asked. And so the people that pose the research questions play a huge role in what kind of data is available. Now, obviously, some things are truly that dichotomous, like pro versus anti-choice. That's, yes, it is. But I hope you see what I'm saying. And then we can level up from science and reasons as these sort of mantles of intellectual prowess to upholding robust meaning behind these words. So believing in science isn't that simple. It's just so much more complicated than people would like to think. And so I think that it's worth interrogating this. And then that sort of limited scope that's been characteristic of the skeptical movement over the last few decades to radical truth-seeking and expanding out of pet issues to everything and anything that, that we all find important when possible. So seeking the whole justice-driven, evidence-driven, context-driven truth broadly and deeply. And I see skepticism eclipsing science as a way of thinking. We know that any individual convincing themselves that their brain is scientific can lead people astray, especially a certain kind of white logic bro who believes all of his thoughts are so profound. And I think we all know at least one of them. As someone who reads piles of scientific papers and talks to scientists and writes about science, I know this much. Humans are human and our brains are human. Our brains are not computers, nor are they laboratories as much as you want them to be. As much as someone wants to believe in their science brain, that idea is an illusion. So rather than science as a way of thinking, I envision a movement or just collaborations in which we examine our own biases and grow out of them together. So rather than individuals walking around with that fantasy science brain, I care about collaborating with accomplices to create communities who think, act, and behave in evidence-based and truth-driven ways. So rather than a way of thinking, we can exercise skepticism as a way of holding and building each other up and of keeping each other accountable. Because as women of color, beyond belief, one thing we all know how to do is handle and dish out real talk. So I would hope that someone would feel comfortable saying to me, hey, I believe that you haven't considered something, or let me explain, or what you said here wasn't right, or did you know that that word was ableist, or vice versa. I think learning to tolerate discomfort is the first step to change, and whiteness has a way to go in that regard. So none of this, of course, is to say that you should never collaborate with some of these organizations or take money from them. By all means, take their money and use their platforms. It's literally the least they can do. I challenge all US humanist and skeptical organizations to not merely reach for diversity, but to implement radical inclusion at all levels, especially in your leadership, and don't drag your feet. And if you don't, then the future of secularism and skepticism won't have a place for your antiquated notions or your lily white organizations. When women of color leave religion, we are wondering, as we've seen at this conference, what's next for us beyond belief? The image here is of a human skull, and the human skull has mesmerized humanity, can be found in so much of our literature and our traditions. It symbolizes that sort of intersection where humanism and good science meet. We're all the same. There are no differences between women's brains and men's brains. There are no distinct skull shapes separating so-called races. When we die, what's left is our decaying bodies and the impact that we had on the world. And as scared as I am of death personally, this to me is what drives me. So I'll close with a quote from our keynote speaker, Tiffany Green, In a recent phone call I had with her, we were talking about disparities in birth outcome for Black women and women of color and non-binary folks. I could talk to her all day. So in talking about this, she voiced what so many of us feel in a familiar way that exemplifies that intersection between humanism and skepticism. And that is that there's no higher power that's going to fix this. It's a human-made problem, and the solution has to be human-made. So that is all I have for you, although of course I could talk to you all day. So thank you, and I'm not sure if there's time for questions, but if there is, I'm happy to take them.
Thank you so much, Kavin. Very informative. So yes, we're gonna take some minutes to put your questions out. So both online and in the room. Are there any questions? Come on up to the microphone. It's awaiting you.
Oh, by the way, if people are not comfortable or for whatever reason don't have their questions right now and think of them later, I really am on Twitter too much. So you can feel free to hit me up. My DMs are even open. Just don't abuse it. Thank you.
I have a question.
Oh,
I
see
wonder,
that.
can
Oh,
you
go
hear me?
ahead. Yes.
Can you hear me? Okay. I wonder about the lack of diversity in, in boards and in governance positions at universities and leadership positions and whatnot. I wonder what your thoughts are about the way that our education system and the way that we, segregate in our schools, among communities and whatnot, if it just all funnels up, and by the time you get to those higher levels, the systemic racism and sexism in our systems have made the choices available to people at the elite achievement levels, have really winnowed down the choices that they have because people have been systemically oppressed throughout the whole process from, the moment they enter the education system.
So, so that's a great question. It's a huge question. There are many experts studying this question. So please do read more about it if you're interested. As you say, yes, I mean, this discrimination, and I don't remember if Tiffany talked about this in her talk, but there's a difference between bias and stereotype and how it plays out across different settings. But yeah, I mean, to be brief, yes, it's all connected. And so certainly, yes, segregation and the quality of education and the quality of everything else that comes from that, as far as what I have learned from my reporting and reading and talking to folks, both, just regular folks living in these living their lives, and then and experts. I mean, yeah, it's just massive.
So I have a question, Kavin. This is Mandisa. Thank you once again for speaking with us
Hi,
and being a
Mandisa.
part of
Thank
the
you.
conference. What would you suggest? And I say this as someone who has served on boards within the secular movement. What would you suggest to those board members and also leaders who might be feeling bullied by their donor base to not, because this has happened. You have some folks who their donors, they might threaten to pull their support if these organizations start actually focusing more on diversity, equity, and inclusion. What advice would you give to those leaders and those board members who are trying to do the right thing, but may feel intimidated by people who may threaten to cut their funding?
I mean, I can't say that I'm at all knowledgeable in fundraising. So of course, what I said at the end of course, we should all work with these organizations as we find appropriate. Excuse me, but one example comes to mind when you ask this question, and it's the example of the American Humanist Association rescinding Richard Dawkins' Humanist of the Year award. I forgot what year that was for. And they got quite a bit of backlash for that. And I believe that that's what you're describing happened in this situation, where at least some donors either threatened to pull or did pull funding. So I'm not sure what the answer is to your question. I mean, I'm sure there are people in the room who know this answer, but it might be worth studying some of what happened in the AHA situation and how that went down, and maybe how to learn from that and figure out that answer to the question you're asking. I know it's a non-answer, but I mean, it's complicated.
Yeah, it is. And that's what's important for people to understand.
Yeah.
But I am a person who encourages people to stand up to those bullies. So for those of us who are running organizations with very, very limited means and who don't have access, they could actually take a lesson from our organization. But
absolutely. I mean, yes, pushing back against these sort of threats. I mean, not everyone has the ability to speak out as much as I do, or as much as you might, Mandisa. Different people have to have different priorities for themselves and their families and their well-being. But people who do have the privilege of being able to speak up with relatively few consequences, I guess, really do, we need to talk about this out in the open, and we need to solve it. And yeah, I mean, I wish I had more answers. I'm not purporting to have answers to these questions, but we need to look into it, I think.
Any more questions? Questions online?
Yes, hello. Thank you for coming to speak on behalf of Women of Color Beyond Belief. I wanted to speak because I wanted to ask a question. It's technically a two-parter, but I feel these questions kind of go hand in hand based on the group that I'm in Indianapolis. And I like the group, and most of the people are very nice, but they're also skewing pretty older and fairly white. It's myself and two other people who are technically the non-white tokens of the group, for lack of a better phrase to describe it. And one of the group members at one point had pointed out what I consider to be a pretty obvious fact of many skeptical and secular groups are white and Eurocentric, which seems kind of obvious to us. I mean, it felt like a pretty obvious turn of phrase. And he caught a lot of shit for it. And when I echoed that same sentiment, I also seemed to have gotten a lot of shit for it. And I didn't understand why, and with the animosity. So do you have any advice on dealing with that social hostility, where it's not actively aggressive, but it's just needlessly shitty and not necessarily kind of approaching it? And then my second question is, as somebody who also gets regularly tokenized, being the only Arab I've known in most of my life outside of my own family in the United States, can you recommend any advice on dealing with tokenization and managing with people's expectations of you as a result?
Yeah, and I think I can combine this with a question that Madison Page had in the chat about how to avoid tokenism in a spirit of DEI. So to the first half of your question, I think you're referring to something that to me feels like, it's a lot of microaggressions and gaslighting, and depending on how you are doing personally, you might be able to handle that, you might not. But there really is find people. I don't know if you're talking about in person, this kind of behavior in person or on social media, and
mix of both.
A mix of both. Okay, so on social media, first of all, there's this group called, I'm not sure if y'all are familiar with them, but it's called White Nonsense Roundup. And it's a group of white volunteers who I believe are pretty well trained in my observation. And like anyone who isn't white can basically tag them into a convo, and like white volunteers will like come to collect their people. It's pretty interesting. And I mean, try it out if you're interested. And in person, I mean, I don't put myself around a certain kind of energy anymore. I've learned from that. And so again, it kind of depends on what you think is important. I think picking your not your battles, but picking what you will and won't engage with is a choice. And so that's a very brief answer to the first half. And then about avoiding tokenism in a spirit of diversity, equity, and inclusion. You know, I've been also doing some work on DEI kind of initiatives, especially in healthcare lately. That's kind of in the pipeline, and I think we all know that DEI on its own can often be only symbolic in nature, and walking the talk is important. So in terms of avoiding tokenism, if I think again of this specific example, and because I think it's illustrative, but you know, Sikivu had that 2016 piece, and then they added this non-white board member, and then you know, more people spoke up, and I did, and then CFI and I parted ways, and then they added a couple more board members. Behind the scenes, what I know happened is that there were very highly qualified non-white board members who specifically work on these issues in both the science space, the skepticism and psychom space, and is very highly respected, and would have, you know, pushed for more what I called radical inclusion, but they rejected those type of people and kind of like put what I think is like people that they know that they could put on their board. And like, in my view, that's tokenization. I'm not going to say that that's an absolute fact. It's, again, a very complicated question, but it's, so radical inclusion is really like including whole people. So don't just, it should be obvious, but like, don't just put a Black person or a trans or non-binary person on your board so you can like show them on your list. Like, bring that whole person in and shape what your organization does. I mean, yeah, I could talk about this a lot, but I hope I've sort of answered that question too.
How are we doing on? One more question, comment.
Hi, Kevin. Can you hear me?
Yes.
Hi, Debbie Allen, Executive Director of the Secular Coalition.
Hi,
for
Debbie.
America. Hi, good to see you. Thank you for bringing these issues to the conversation. And I think, God, there's so much I want to say. This is a long conversation. These organizations started so many, many years ago, and they all have a history, and they are as you see them today. And I think that we are trying very hard, not hard enough, maybe not well enough, but we're trying to improve our organizations in the ways that they need to benefit from your experience and your insights. We invite people to join us, but like you said, we need to bring in the whole person. And one of the problems that we have within the secular movement is the whole person includes someone who enthusiastically identifies as an atheist, a non-believer, a skeptic, a free thinker, and has experience and membership, insight into the organizations. And we need to build better on-roads into our organizations at the membership level, and then help move people up into leadership roles. We also need to look more broadly and farther for leaders that we can bring into the movement, into board positions, et cetera. What I hear at our meetings of the membership and the leadership is that there is a desire, an interest, and a real effort to diversify, to include more people with diverse talents and life experiences. And it's one of the reasons why many of us contribute to this conference in particular. So I just sent out an invitation to our entire membership to nominate themselves or others they feel capable or interested in being a board member to our organization. And I know that same invitation to thousands, tens of thousands of people goes out to others. And I encourage anybody that's listening today to reach out to an organization that they feel interested in or inspired by, to seek out leadership opportunities. They can reach me at debbie@secular.org, and I will be happy to speak with them and address also their concerns or complaints about the lack of diversity in the movement.
Well, thanks, Debbie. I hope people will email you, and and thanks for taking that that initial step. Now, of course, this is a huge conversation, and I could talk about it all day. My opinion as a lifelong atheist who was raised by a very staunch, loud immigrant atheist is that enthusiasm for secularism can look different than people might think it can look. And so, I mean, I think that's a question and a conversation to have. But of course, like, yeah, so do this as fast as all of you can. Like, I don't think there's any reason for it to take this long. But again, thank you for doing that and for sharing your view.
And I'd like to thank you, Kavin, for being a part of the conference and engaging in what is absolutely a conversation that has to be had. So thank you so much.
Thank you. Thanks, everyone.